Knowing that drafts are unconstitutional, will you comply with the one likely to come in future days? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be discussing the constitutionality of a draft and whether or not, if the upcoming draft, something we're predicting, not something that is set in stone by any sort of governing policy, if the upcoming draft is going to be resisted and if it should be resisted. So while we're not necessarily going to get directly into the moral basis of that should, we are going to talk about the should aspects that the founding generation would have posed if posed with the question, are conscriptions legitimate, legal, constitutional aspects of a free governing state? So first, I'm going to say if a draft is called, at least for the current conflict going between Iran, the US, and Israel, it cannot be obeyed. Why? Before we even get into the legitimacy of conscriptions and whether or not the US government has the authority to call a conscription, a draft, a drought, all three of those words are synonyms. Before we even get into that, we know for absolute certainty, for absolute fact, that the current conflict going on between Iran, the US, and Israel is unconstitutional, is illegitimate. Why? Because a declaration of war, which it's now finally being recognized as a war, which the US is involved directly, not as a proxy, not as a proxy, but directly. It's now being admitted by the same folks who just 3 weeks ago were saying, it's not a war, it's not a war, we're just helping. It's not a war. Well, now they're calling it a war. Like in that example where I showed Will Chamberlain saying, I don't know why he wouldn't call it a war because the legalities or whatever. Now they're finally admitting it's a war. The point being, it's an unconstitutional action because, according to the US Constitution, the only body of government in the US government that can declare a war is Congress. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the US Constitution real quick and see exactly if that is true. So in Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution, Section 8 details the powers of the US Congress, and among those powers is to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Given there hasn't been a formal declaration of war against Iran from the US, any further engagement, especially now that they're openly acknowledging that it is a war, any further engagement would be unconstitutional. And if you'd like more information about that, I went into very great detail from individuals like George Washington about how any sort of offensive is unconstitutional until it is given or granted permission by the US Congress. You can go find all that information in the Will Chamberlain lecture I did about a week ago now, maybe a week and a half ago. Bunch of great information in there. So further down, so that's the first premise. It's an unconstitutional war. It's unconstitutional action conducted by the US government. Further down is going to be the best argument in terms of the US government in any way being given any sort of conscription or drafting authority. It's going to be clause, what is this one? I think this is clause 11. Yes, it looks like clause 11. So that would be 12, 13, 14, 15. Clause 15 and 16, which say respectively, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So really, if there is any sort of implied, not directly enumerated, any sort of implied authority, it's probably going to be in clause, what did we say that was, 15? Yeah, 14 or 15. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So clause 15, which says to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. The problem comes when we look at those three reasons to call forth the militia. So does this give a carte blanche? Again, it's not even an explicit permission, but does it in any way give a carte blanche permission slip to the U.S. government to conscript citizens, to draft citizens and go fight? We can't even call it a legitimate war because it hasn't been declared war, so it's not a constitutional act. Even if we toy with this idea that the US government is given a conscription power, it can only be used for three reasons: to execute the laws of the Union. You can't execute US laws in foreign lands. US laws apply only to states in the US who are members of the US. So you can't enforce US laws on Iran. To suppress insurrections. Insurrections are within. So to stop insurrections here, not abroad. And repel invasions. Invasions are attempts to come into the states, which means the defense would be here, not sent abroad. So again, even if we grant a very, very broad, unsupported belief that the US government in any way has the authority to conscript, to draft, to call a draught, it can only be done for these three reasons, none of which include being sent to foreign nations, being sent to foreign lands, and fighting conflicts that were never constitutionally declared by the US Congress. The only reason we're showing this concern now is because of the recent publication from the governing authorities, the US governing authorities, in which they elected to increase the enlistment age to 42 for non-prior service applicants. The reason we're so concerned about this and how it indicates that there is a draft incoming. And I hear all the counter arguments. Well, Caleb, that means you don't understand how the military works. You don't understand how things work, because we've got reservists, we've got guard, we've got all of these different stepping stones that come in before a draft ever comes in. To that, I'd say if things were working the way that they're supposed to, one, there would have been a formal declaration of war against Iran. And two, there are so many examples that we can allude to right now of where the things that should work the way they work should be doing what they are told to be doing, but aren't doing it. That was a really convoluted way of saying we have a list, a bona fide, verified list of child traffickers, many of them residing in the States. How many indictments have been brought? How many charges have been brought? How many have been imprisoned? The entire "that's not how things work" argument has lost a lot of its persuasion and sway in our hearts. Even if you don't want to consider that argument, the way things should work would include a formal declaration of war against Iran before any sort. Even if you wanted to grant the idea that the US government has the power to conscript, which it very clearly doesn't, it would have to be a formal declaration of war. So the reason we're so concerned about this recent publication from US governing authorities increasing enlistment age to 42 is it indicates a number of different things, and it has consistently indicated these couple of things throughout multiple different nations, throughout multiple different body politics. Whenever the age of recruitment and enlistment for military forces increases in inclusivity, that means the prime supplier, so young athletic men, the prime supplier, the prime applicant, the prime demographic filling up the military is not meeting its quota. That indicates the military is currently struggling a lot. Though it has all of these cool gadgets and all of these cool drones and planes and jets and ships, they're having a very difficult time finding people who are most apt to take up these positions, the same demographic that it's always been throughout all the history of all of these different body politics. Because there's a shortage of that, it doesn't really matter the technology they have because no one is manning that technology. So what this has indicated, especially when they start going for, and 42 is not even old, it's just older. When they start increasing the age limit for enlistment, that means one, they're hurting for recruits, and two, that prime demographic isn't showing high morale for whatever cause they're looking to recruit for, to go fight for. Those two things are very, very bad. What they predate, what they are precedent for, or what they immediately precede, is a collapse of that military. Disorganization, inefficiency, and of course, it is the key demographic of every military. If that key demographic is no longer participating, your military is going to show it. And it's probably not going to be for the better. So now that we've kind of founded our concerns about a more than likely future draft, I want to show to you how Mr. Thomas Jefferson, what he believed to be the case about this idea of calling a draft, a conscription. So he actually wrote a letter, Thomas Jefferson to John Adams Williamsburg, May 16th, 1777. This is kind of alluding to what George Washington was wanting to do during the American Revolution when he was getting frustrated with the inefficiencies of the volunteer state militias. He was wanting to conscript, he was wanting to call draughts and drafts, and he eventually did in a number of occasions, but realistically, they weren't all that well implemented. They weren't all that well enforced, and in much of the public sphere were pretty much nullified, which means, in essence, Washington had to depend upon the volunteers and state militias in order to comprise the Continental Army, the American Army. So here's what Thomas Jefferson said to this idea of conscription, to calling a draught. He said, "Dear sir, matters in our part of the continent are too much in quiet to send you news from hence. Our battalions for the continental service were some time ago so far filled as rendered the recommendation of a draught from the militia hardly requisite, and the more so as in this country it ever was the most unpopular and impracticable thing that could be attempted. Our people, even under the monarchical government, had learnt to consider it as the last of all oppressions. I learned from our delegates that the Confederation is again on the carpet, a great and a necessary work, but I fear almost desperate. The point of representation is what most alarms me, as I fear the great and small colonies are bitterly determined not to cede. Will you be so good as to recollect the proposition I formerly made you in private, and try if you can work into some good to save our Union? It was that any proposition might be negatived by the representatives of a majority of the people of America, or of a majority of the colonies of America. The former secures the larger, the latter the smaller colonies. I have mentioned it too many here. The good Whigs, I think, will so far cede their opinions for the sake of the Union, and others we care little for. The journals of Congress not being printed earlier gives more uneasiness than I would ever wish to see produced by any act of that body from whom alone I know our salvation can proceed. In our assembly, even the best affected think it an indignity to free men to be voted away life and fortune in the dark. Our house have lately written for a MS copy of your journals, not meaning to desire a communication of anything ordered to be kept secret. I wish the regulation of the post office adopted by Congress last September could be put in practice. It was for the riders to travel night and day, and to go their several stages 3 times a week. The speedy and frequent communication of intelligence is really of great consequence. So many falsehoods have been propagated that nothing now is believed unless coming from Congress or camp. Our people, merely for want of intelligence which they may rely on, are become lethargic and insensible of the state they are in. Had you ever a leisure moment, I should ask a letter from you sometime directed to the care of Mr. Dick, Fredericksburg. But having nothing to give in return, it would be a tax on your charity as well as your time. The esteem I have for you privately, as well as for your public importance, will always render assurances of your health and happiness agreeable. I am, dear sir, your friend and servant, Thomas Jefferson. If that wasn't clear, there was an original amendment proposed by Mr. James Madison, father of the U.S. Constitution, which actually passed the U.S. House of Representatives, or what would eventually become the U.S. House of Representatives during the Philadelphia Convention debates. And the original amendment, so we're talking about Article 2 to the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution, the original proposal, while it passed through the House, was just tossed aside in the Senate. In fact, we don't even know if it was tossed aside. There isn't any record of exactly what happened regarding the original proposal for the second article to the Bill of Rights of the U.S. Constitution. And that original proposal, again, submitted by James Madison, read like this: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Frankly, that probably would have been a better iteration of Article 2 to the Bill of Rights. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. That last part is the one most important here. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. So again, even if we toyed with the idea that the U.S. government in some way, even implicitly, was granted the power of conscription, one, we would need a formal declaration of war, and two, the founding generation shows that that implication isn't actually found or rooted in the U.S. Constitution. And then, of course, it was practiced by the preceding executives, preceding presidents. If there is to be any sort of good faith, any sort of positive response to the more than likely coming draft, there must first be a constitutional, formal declaration of war announced by the U.S. Congress, passed by the U.S. Congress, and formalized by the U.S. Congress. Otherwise, any sort of action, any further action taken in this conflict, because it's not a war yet, it hasn't, well, they're calling it a war, they're finally recognizing it as a war, but it hasn't been a formally declared war. Any further action in this conflict from the U.S. is unconstitutional. Again, we'll hear the counter arguments of, well, this is what past presidents have done, and it's just not how things work, Caleb. There's not going to be a draft. The whole point, or the promise that the Trump administration made during their campaign, was that they weren't going to be like every other president. That they were going to be, supposedly, America first. That they were supposedly not going to be starting new wars and getting further involved in foreign conflicts. So this idea that, well, previous presidents did it is null and void, because the promise from the Trump administration during the campaign was, we're not going to be like every other president. We're not going to be a part of the deep state. And as for the other not contradictory, but the other oppositional argument that, well, Caleb, that's just not how things work. We have reservists, so on and so forth. Again, if the rules were being followed and things were working the way they should, there would have been a formal declaration of war. And then, of course, the other example of, well, we have a list of bona fide human traffickers that haven't been indicted, haven't been charged, haven't been arrested. So, the Gen Z, the currently prime demographic for a fighting force for the military, if and when, probabilistically pretty high right now, a draft is called, do not comply. You can think a third of Gen Z has already been slaughtered before even taking their first breath in the womb. This, like what took place in the 1910s, what took place in the 1940s, what took place again in the 1960s and 70s, is to make the best effort of slaughtering that other two-thirds, the remaining two-thirds of Generation Z. There has not been a formal declaration of war. There is no power in the U.S. Constitution granting the U.S. government the authority to run conscription, draught, or draft. And the author of the U.S. Declaration of Independence said that a draft, and conscription is considered the last of all oppressions. Do not comply. So if you have any questions, if you'd like further documentation, maybe more primary sources, I'd be more than happy to provide that. Just let me know down in the comments. Likewise, if you think I'm totally off my rocker, or if there's a legal topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post those down in the comments as well, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to equip you with the necessary skills and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and until I see y'all in the next lecture for the next topic, I bid you all farewell.